So I'm going to be talking about Overload and the making of Overload, which was the spiritual successor to Descent. I'll talk about Descent in a minute. We spent 4 years working on this. Well, it'll be 4 years in September, really, depending on how you look at it, and which is always a surprise because you think, oh, is this a short project? It's a small project. It'll just take a year and a half, and then it always takes 4 years. Except for my first project, it actually did take a year and a half. Descent, we got done really fast, but everything else takes much longer than I thought. We released in May on Steam and GOG for the PC, and we have console versions coming out soon. We are in submission as of today on the PlayStation 4, and Xbox is a big mystery because they have some sort of like complicated requirements about encrypted packets, and Unity doesn't support encrypted packets, so we had to complain to Unity, and then Unity's come up with a proposal. Microsoft has to approve it, and Unity has to implement it, and blah, blah, blah. So it's going to be weeks and weeks until the Xbox version is done, which really stinks. But PS4 is pretty much done. So I started way back in 1986 in Champaign, Illinois, working at Sublogic Corporation, where we did flight simulators on 8-bit and 16-bit PCs, which was great fun, programmed everything in assembly language and lots of good stuff. I did that for a while. Then I worked for a guy who was based in California on a driving game. And then that company I was working for merged with another company, became Looking Glass Technologies out in Boston, where I worked for about a year from when that was founded. And I worked, the 3D engine I was working on for this driving game was also used for Ultima Underworld. So if people know that, it was like the first real smooth 3D dungeon crawling game. And so after that, I've been working on flying games. I worked on this dungeon crawling game, and we thought, hey, what if you could fly through a dungeon? So that became Descent. We pitched that to Looking Glass, and they weren't interested. So me and my partner, Mike Koulas, who was my coworker at Sublogic when I started there in '86, went off and formed our own company and made Descent, which released in March of '94. We had not March of '95. We had a shareware version in right around Christmas of '94. Then the full version came out in '95. So then we had this company, Parallax, that split into two parts. As you heard, my part was based here in Ann Arbor, called Outrage Entertainment. Mike's part was in Champaign, Volition, which is still around to this day. My company shut in like 2003. We were acquired by THQ, and then they shut us down a year and a half later. And then I went off and did some other stuff, stayed at home with my kids, and got a job doing sort of game-like simulation work for a company in Saline. Well, they were in Ann Arbor, and then in Saline. Did some pretty cool stuff there, like we did this driving simulator for the Secret Service and the State Department, where you would like have simulated attacks by terrorists and stuff. So it was, it wasn't a game per se, but it was very gamey. So we got to do cool models of DC and drive from the White House and get shot at. So that was cool. And then for years, Mike and I have been talking about doing an updated version of Descent, basically. Doing a version with modern graphics. So we talked about it for a long time. 2002, or 2012 rather, we made a push to get that to happen, and couldn't quite get the pieces together. But then around 2014, things really came together. And mostly what came together is that this one guy who we really wanted to work on the project became available, and his name is Luke Schneider. He runs a company called Radiant Games. He's worked at Volition in the past. He worked for me here in Ann Arbor before my company shut down, and then he went to Champaign and worked at Volition for a while, and then he has his own company called Radiant Games where he makes little shoot-'em-up games. And he was a huge Descent fan. That's how we hired him. He sent us like his homemade levels and stuff. Was a big fan, and sent us these really angry letters about bugs we had in the game. And so, like we had this great bug where like you couldn't kill one of the hardest bosses on the highest difficulty because we scaled everything up and it overflowed the imager. And he was really mad about that, but none of us could play on that difficulty level, so we didn't care. Anyway, so Luke finally, he came to a good time for him where he was sort of between projects. I finished up some stuff. He's got a bunch of games that he made called like, this one called Inferno, and something called Joy Joy. He did a Powerpuff Girls game for somebody. And anyway, but they're all like these little little shoot 'em up games, a lot of mobile stuff, really bright colored stuff. And Luke is amazing because he's a programmer and a designer and an artist and a musician. So he does all, like for his own games, he does them all himself, which is pretty impressive. So he became interested, so we said, great, he's going to do it. He was going to do it mostly by himself. It was going to take like a year and a half. And he started in September of 2014 rather. And he did the whole beginning part himself, worked on, basically got the game up and running, got the flying mechanics working, got a bunch of tools, wrote a little level editor. He doesn't like to use anybody else's editor, so he just writes his own. Got it all working, and then he sort of got discouraged and wanted to do some other stuff on his own, so he took a little break, did that. And then that fall, we had to sort of decide what we were going to do. This was now in 2015. What we were going to do with this project, because we worked on it for a while, it made some good progress, but now it was sort of Morgan. And he said he was interested in working on it, but only if he could have some help, because he decided it was too big of a project. I think, again, future creep isn't a surprise to anyone, probably, but it became a lot bigger project than we thought. So we sort of rebooted that in September of 2015. We hired an artist who had recently gotten fired from Volition. That was very convenient for us. He got fired, and like the next week we hired him. It was very good. And then Mike and I, who a long time ago had been programmers, and for a long time had not been programmers because we'd been managing companies and doing other stuff, both started programming again. So from that time on, we were a real team. We had an office in Urbana, actually, but in Champaign, it was actually Luke's old office, but we had a bunch of people working in there, and now we have like 4 people on the team, so it was kind of a real project. We started the project on Unreal because we thought Unreal was like, I don't know, so we thought it had better graphics. It was a sort of like more cutting edge engine. But we, and really mostly Luke, because he was the one working on it at that time, found didn't match his workflow very well, and he didn't find he was very productive in it, so we switched to Unity, which I've been totally happy with. I mean, of course, there's been lots and lots of frustrations, like with anything, but it's been a really good tool. So then up to that point, and for a little while longer, we basically were funding this out of our pockets. There was just one guy on it who was working fairly cheaply, but then we added more people, and Mike and I still weren't paid, which makes it easier to do. But we had to start thinking about funding. So in March of 2016, we did a Kickstarter. Shortly before that, we had found out, no, it was actually a year before that, we found out about another game coming out called Descent Underground. So this was a bunch of guys who had broken off of the what's that thing they call that? Big $100 million monstrosity down in Texas. What? What? No, I don't know. That big space game. Anyway, whatever. So, yeah, Star Citizen. Thank you. So they come off the Star Citizen team, and they were old Descent fans. So I started this project, and they were doing it. And then Interplay, who is our publisher and who owns the Descent trademark, we don't own the Descent trademark. They approached them and said, hey, you want to license the Descent name? And they're like, okay, sure. So they took it and became Descent Underground. Proved to be, well, we knew we weren't going to be Descent because we didn't want to work with that publisher anymore because we had a long history of difficulty with them not paying us and a series of lawsuits and all sorts of stuff. So we knew we wouldn't have the Descent name, but then it turns out there was another Descent game coming out. So they contacted us and said, oh, do you want to work with us? And we'd already started on our project, but we hadn't announced it yet, so it was all kind of tricky. And they had a Kickstarter, did very well. I think they raised like $600,000 or something, but they're still not out. They eventually signed on with the publisher, and they're supposed to come out this fall, but you know how that goes. So we did our Kickstarter in March 2016. I don't know how many of you have done Kickstarters before, I know people who have, but it is hard. And when we started, someone said to me like, oh, you find out it takes all of your time is the Kickstarter. That's all you do for like the whole month. And I'm like, oh, that's crazy, But it's totally true. It takes all of your time. So we had, 4 people plus some other people helping us. We just did stuff for the Kickstarter constantly. We're putting out, posts and videos and updates. We actually had done a little playable demo of the game that we released at the beginning of the Kickstarter. They were updating that and adding features, and it's really hard. It's really hard, and it's exhausting, and it's emotionally exhausting. You know, you're waking up in the middle of the night and checking your pledges, and it's just. So I recommend you all do it once, just so you know what the hell it is. But I mean, I don't think I want to do it again. But it was an interesting experience, and definitely had some great benefits. We got a group of people behind us who were very interested and very vested. We had a lot of people just pledged $25 or whatever to get a copy of the game, which I think is what makes the most sense. But then we had some real crazy people who pledged hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is really kind of humbling and frightening when you realize that people are like that committed to something you're working on, and a real sense of obligation. One thing we did during the Kickstarter was we just, for a little bit of hype, we released an update with a new mode, a challenge mode, which is like a time-based thing where whatever you try to kill as many robots as you can during a certain amount of time, and then we had leaderboards and scores. And that ended up becoming a fairly large part of the game. That was just sort of added on a whim during the Kickstarter to get some attention. One thing that sort of surprised us was we knew there'd be this group of Descent fans out there who would be interested in this project. And a lot of the sort of casual Descent fans really jumped on it. But then there was also this small group of hardcore Descent fans who weren't so interested because they're still playing Descent. Right, so it's like this 20-year-old game, and they have updated versions of it because we released the source code many years ago. And they have some updated versions. They still play, and so some of them ended up getting behind the project, and it's great to have those people, but they're also really, really hardcore. Anything that's even slightly different is totally unacceptable, and so it presents its own challenges. We hope for one of those Kickstarters that comes out for $300,000 and raises $2 million, but we did not do that. We made our $300,000 just barely. I think we were kind of missed the peak for Kickstarter. I think a year earlier, game Kickstarters were doing really, really well, and then this was sort of when game Kickstarters were coming down, and actually the board game Kickstarters were just picking up around that time, which are now really, really big. Or maybe they've already hit their peak. I'm not sure what. And then the brand issues also hurt us too, because people had backed this other Descent game, and then they were confused about who we were, or they'd already spent some money and didn't want to spend more money. So that was kind of an issue. We thought, well, the brand thing doesn't matter that much, but I think it really did. If we'd come out as Descent by the makers of the original game, I think we'd have gotten a lot more attention and raised a lot more money. It's just hard to get. It's hard to get, and this is sort of a theme throughout the whole project, it's hard to get word out there to a broad audience these days. I can talk about that a little bit more later. So another thing, we made crazy promises during the Kickstarter because we were desperate. So that always, you have to live with that down the line, everything you said. And sometimes we forget what we promised because, it's 2 in the morning, yes, we'll do that. But it did really help us to have that fan base behind the project, really invested. We promised some demos and other things, and had to keep in constant communication with people. And people were really, really supportive. And even when we took much longer than we thought, we get these really nice messages. Oh, we'd rather you do it right than get it out too early or whatever, which is very, very nice. We're still doing physical rewards. We've been ordering and packing up things all week. I'm going down to Champaign on Monday to sign a bunch of stuff that we promised, signed copies of the game that we have to ship out. So yeah, it's a lot of work, and we ended up spending a fair amount of money. I mean, you don't think about it, but then you promise someone a keychain, and it turns out they live in Bulgaria. It costs $25 to ship a keychain to Bulgaria, so it's a pretty expensive reward. So we're dealing with that now. It's a lot of work, and but we're very thankful for those people, and we're not begrudging them at all. But it's just something to think about. So when we were doing our Kickstarter, one of our former sound guys, Dan Wentz, who'd worked with us in the past on Descent 2 and other games, came and helped out, and then ended up joining the project. We hired another artist, Victor Duarte, who'd come from Volition. He was actually still at Volition, so we actually did poach him. And then we sort of started ramping up, and that was in mid-2016. And that fall, we went to PAX West and showed as part of the Indie Mega Booth. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but that's a really nice service. So these, instead of getting your own booth, which is complicated and expensive and it has a lot of overhead, Indie Mega Booth basically rents a whole section of PAX with like 20 booths, and then you can apply and rent, sort of sublease a booth from them. And then they deal with a lot of the logistics and promoting and getting all the equipment and stuff. So, which is actually a lot of work. I mean, just getting the computers and the monitors and everything. And you have to, some of the stuff you have to rent from their suppliers, and some stuff you can bring. And then it's never quite clear what's going to work together. So that was a big help. I definitely recommend that system. And our original plan was to do a single-player only game with possibly multiplayer following. And then during the Kickstarter, we promised, okay, we will do multiplayer because, we're desperate. And so original plan was to have a release about a year later, so March 2017 with just single-player for PC and consoles, and then following up multiplayer later. And then that slipped kind of October 2017, and then it slipped a little bit more, and then we decided to do, at some point in there, we decided to do an early access release. So in March of 2017, which was a year after our Kickstarter, we did an early access release on Steam. Again, this was helpful for feedback and for developing a fan base, and again, it turned out not to be a huge revenue source for us. It was nice to have some money coming in, and get those people, and we're getting more people involved, but it was not a huge, So one of the guys we worked with had been on this project called The Long Dark, which sold like 400,000 copies in early access. We're like, yeah, let's do that. Did not work out for us in the same way. So we came out in early access. Probably the very best thing about early access was that we knew the game basically worked. So you always have this sense of panic sort of at the end of a project, like what if it doesn't really work? Or what if there's like huge problems I don't know about? Because you've got 10 machines you're running this game on, and you're trying to release it to thousands and thousands of people. What if it doesn't work? Well, we knew the game worked because we had thousands of people who owned it on early access and were playing it. So that was really nice. We knew that when we released our final version, it was just a small increment from like the previous early access release. So it wasn't a big. It felt like it took away a lot of the risk in the project, and that was a big help for us. But again, not a ton of money. So sometime around late 2017, with plans to release like in March. So it's like we had to do the whole multiplayer thing in 2 months, and we didn't make March, but we did make end of May, which is all in all pretty good, I think. And we ended up pushing the console versions back. We decided we didn't have, mostly because Alan was doing both the Xbox and multiplayer, and then I was doing the PlayStation 4 version, and we decided we just couldn't get all of it done at the same time. So we ended up going for the multiplayer and released those at the end of May, and console versions coming up. Console versions have been fairly easy. Unity, basically just works. It took me a day probably to get the game up and running on PlayStation 4. Even our multiplayer basically just worked on PlayStation 4. There's a ton of stuff you have to do to meet all the requirements, like disk error handling and all sorts of stuff, and they're like save game system's kind of wonky. So the basic stuff worked very easily, and then all these little peripheral things around the edges turned out to be kind of a hassle. But on the whole, it was fairly easy process. So yeah, and then right around the end of last year too, we more than a year ago, I think probably around March of 2017, we brought on a full-time tester. So this was another guy who got fired from Volition, which I highly recommend being in the same town as a really big video game company. So he was an ex-Volition guy, so we hired him. He worked with us for, it's been a year and a half now, and he'd been a test lead at Volition, I think, at one point. And so and it was great. It's great to have testing in-house. I mean, obviously it's a time saver for a programmer or a designer to have someone else providing feedback and testing on things and doing all the like annoying, stupid things that you never really would do yourself because it's too tedious, which is great. It's really good. And then we added, so that was in like March of 2017, and then last November we added a whole pile more testers who were all, again, ex-Volition people who've been laid off after the end of Agents of Mayhem. So we ended up having we hired 4 more testers. So sort of for the end of the project, we had basically 5 full-time testers, which was great. And at this point, you know, we long past spent the Kickstarter money, and we're getting some money from early access and then some self-funding too. So then we had to come to the release. Again, this is a big difference from when I started in the industry, where we had publishers. So we would sign with a publisher who would handle all the manufacturing, distribution, marketing, PR, customer support, all that stuff. So this time we self-published. We had to figure out what to do about marketing and PR, which turns out to be kind of a mystery to me. I think maybe it's a mystery to everybody. You know, 20 years ago, you know, there were like 10 maybe big magazines. You could fly around and do press visits to all the big magazines. They would write articles. You could place ads in, again, these 10 big magazines. And that was basically it. That was, you know, it was very well defined what the marketing and PR universe was. And now it's obviously much more complicated. There are still some, obviously, there's some print magazines in some places, and a lot of big game websites. So you can still do the same sort of stuff by trying to get reviews in those websites. But then a lot of it is controlled by, you know, nebulous influencers who sometimes you can pay them to provide services, which is you know, kind of weird. Sometimes it's very explicitly, they say this is a paid, whatever, which is good. And then sometimes you just sort of hope to get lucky and have some big YouTuber like your game and feature it. So we ended up hiring a US PR firm and a UK PR firm. So we hired them for basically about 3 months, sort of before and after the launch. And they were responsible for basically talking to press and trying to get, you know, reviews placed and whatever. And then we hired a third guy who was like our influencer coordinator. So he'd come out of a VR world and had been doing games for a long time and knew a lot of streamers and YouTubers and stuff like that. And so we ended up paying the 3 of them for, you know, 3 or 4 months' work each. And it was really hard to determine, you know, the stuff is so nebulous, whether there was any value out of that. I think in the end, we probably overpaid for a value. We could have maybe hired just a US person to handle UK and US. We could have tried to do it ourselves. It's hard to know. I mean, you put all this stuff out there, you get some reviews from some publications, you don't from other publications, you don't know. You're just sort of at the whim of the press and the influencers. We did a little bit of marketing. We tried to hire or talk to some marketing people, but a lot of people are like, well, what does it even mean to be marketing anymore? It used to mean placing ads in a magazine or placing an ad on television or whatever, or even radio back in the day. But we ended up basically, our PR firm sort of helped us with marketing. We ended up doing some paid advertising, so we did some like website takeovers on our launch day. So like PC Games End in the UK and PC Gamer in the US and maybe Rock Paper Shotgun or something. So it's one of those things where the background is like all the art from your game and whatever, and you click on a link. We did that. We paid a couple streamers to do like featured streams of our game. Again, this was through like through some network of streamers in the UK. Again, hard to tell if any of that stuff paid off. I think we probably ended up spending maybe $70,000 or something on marketing and PR, which is a lot of money. Our total budget was probably around $1 million, somewhere in that range. So it was a fair amount of money, but not a huge portion of the budget, and certainly not as big an amount of money as a huge game will spend. You know, a game that costs $100 million, they'll spend another 10 or 20 million on marketing, TV ads, and God knows what. So We had a nice bump this summer. As we said before, our Steam reviews have been very good. We are overwhelmingly positive on Steam, which means you have a, I think, 95 or 96% or above rating, and you have at least 500 reviews. If you have less than 500 views, you're just very positive. So we were just desperately waiting to hit 500 so we could be overwhelmingly positive, which was very nice. One of our initial worries was that there was basically a hardcore group of Descent fans out there, and that maybe that was all there was, and we'd already sold to them during the Kickstarter, and we were never going to sell another copy. And we hoped that wasn't true. I think it came out to be more true than we would have liked. There is, the 97% or whatever rating, people are very, very happy with the game, but again, it's a very small group of people who are into this thing. They're very happy, and we haven't really reached a broader audience that we would have liked. But we've got a couple of interesting negative reviews, people who say, like, well, we've got one really interesting recently where someone said that there are a lot of games that do like modern gameplay with old-looking graphics, but our game is like new-looking graphics with older gameplay, and he thought that was really a missed opportunity that we didn't sort of integrate a lot of gameplay lessons and developments in the last 20 years, because we were focused pretty much on just doing the basic thing with a modern presentation. So my main takeaways from the project, one is that programming is great fun. I was so glad to be programming again. I really enjoyed that almost every day. It was a little frustrating in the very beginning because until you figure out how Unity works, you're like, every time you have to do something, it's like trying to figure out, well, how does Unity want me to do this thing? Whereas our previous games, we just written engines from the ground up, and it was all the way we wanted it to be, and it was all easy to modify. So there was a bit of a learning curve in trying to figure out, like, what is the right way that Unity wants me to do this thing. But in the end, it turned out to be totally fun. We programmed in C#, which is a really great language to program in. Very clean and very powerful. Probably did some things that weren't super efficient because it's so fun to do them in C#. Unity, as I said, turned out to be pretty successful. We were happy with that. Happy with the capabilities. The graphics have gotten consistently better. The cost isn't terrible. Cross-platform support has been good. So on the whole, marketing and PR are still difficult. We either didn't figure out how to get influencers that we needed, or we didn't get lucky. I'm not sure if there's something we could have done better, or if it's just whatever. We found out that to some extent Overload is a niche product, as I said. We were hoping not, and we're still hopeful. We're still hopeful that the console releases will get a fairly broad audience, and our sales have been, although not huge, been consistent. So we're really counting on continue selling a certain number of copies for the next every month for the next couple of years to get our money back, which is sort of a big change from the old days, because 20 years ago when you had the shelf space, you were on the shelves for a month or two, and then you had to get off. You had to clear room for the next games that came out. So you either made your money or you didn't within the first few months. And now we can continue to sell. I mean, even the old games, the old Descent games are selling on GOG and Steam right now, and we're still making money off of those. So, and those are 20-year-old games. So we're hoping for basically the long tail, as they say, that this will, keep selling at a reasonable rate for a long time. I think we found out that brand names mattered more than we hoped. We thought, oh, it's okay, we'll get the word out. But we constantly were surprised that people were still hearing about us even at a late date. Years after we'd done our Kickstarter, even after we'd announced, people would say, oh, I never even heard about this project. So I think if we had the brand name, that would have made a difference. One thing we did that turned out to be nice for us was we released the soundtrack as a separate add-on. When we had all the music anyway, we packaged it up, we did some nice art, and I think we probably had to do it because we promised it as a Kickstarter reward. But it turns out that we offered that on Steam as a bundle, so the game is like $30, and for $33 you get the game and the soundtrack, and we actually sold a fair number of those. So basically people, I think, $3, whatever, it's not that much. But it's a nice little add-on that we got for not much cost on our part. So those are all my notes. I'm happy to answer Any questions that people have about the project or about game development in general, to my limited knowledge? Yeah.
Yeah, two questions. So first, you're porting to PlayStation 4, Xbox. Any plans on a Switch version?
So we're going to investigate Switch. I'm a little worried that the Switch isn't going to be powerful enough, and I guess also when it's in portable mode, it's reduced power. And so our guy Alan Lawrence, who's doing our Xbox version, is going to be doing a Switch port of Long Dark. I don't know if that's announced or not, so don't tell anyone. And he's gonna check it out. When he's got that hardware, he'll check out Overload and see how Overload runs and see if it's worth. If it's close enough that we can spend some time to make it work, or if it's just hopeless.
Awesome.
I mean, it's been a surprisingly successful platform, and it's super cool. So we'd like to do it if we can.
Awesome. Second question. So when you were deciding to release the early access build, how did you know when your game was good enough to put out there and get feedback while not disappointing fans?
Yeah.
How do you know that?
Right. So that's one question. Another question is what do you want to give away or not give away to early access?
Yeah.
So we decided fairly early on not to give away any of the story. So we released. So this was a case where having the challenge mode really helped us because we could release a fairly small part of the game, which is just a few challenge levels, and you can play them and they're replayable, and you try to beat your score, and we online leaderboards. So that was all pretty fun. So we sort of focused on that. We released a test single player level, and then we released a couple of the single player levels, but without like the voice and all the story elements. So I think our thing was just basically once we had those challenge mode levels that were playable and fun, we figured there was enough value there that we could go ahead and release that. And then we gave all of our Kickstarter backers who pledged like the $25, they got the early access right away. We'd done a couple of demos earlier than that. So actually, we ended up doing releases. I think we did 3 in the year after our Kickstarter before our early access. Then we did the early access, and we released every maybe 2 months after that. So there is a real cost to that. I mean, we have, every time you do a build, like a real release build, everyone sort of focuses on that for a week. And whatever else they were supposed to be working on doesn't get done, and it's all focused on that. And then, you do the build, and everything's great, and oh no, there's a bug, and then you got to start all over again. So there's a real cost to that. The good thing is that a lot of that cost is something you were going to pay anyway. You were going to have to, at the end of the project, fix all those bugs anyway. So catching them early to do an early access release is kind of nice, and it made the end of the project less, less horrendous. I've been on projects where you sort of get to the end, and then all of a sudden there's like months of work because like all the things that aren't quite done or don't quite work together or weren't quite right now have to get taken care of. So having all those frequent releases was a big help for that.
Awesome. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Regarding marketing, did you try, or was it too expensive to go with Google Ads on general audience?
We did a little bit of advertising with Facebook and Google and Twitter.
Maybe Weather Underground, places like that.
And again, it's hard to tell if how much that stuff pays off. We would try to look for little blips. I mean, sometimes you could see if a big review came out, you'd see a blip or something. During our Kickstarter, I think like Kotaku or something did a story, and we saw a big blip like right after that. So
you have some analytics.
So, but it's hard. It's really hard to tell. You can do a fair amount of that stuff fairly cheaply, like the Facebook advertising and stuff. It's fairly cheap, and hopefully you can get it targeted well enough to matter. But it's really hard to tell. Hard for me to tell anyway.
Yeah, I was wondering, you said that you had a few people like after the Kickstarter say they didn't even know about the Kickstarter. So did you learn anything like how to get the word out to your fans?
Yeah. So one of the things we found out was that, as I said, we sort of missed the peak of Kickstarter, and a lot of the press was kind of burned out. So we got feedback from a lot of press outlets that they weren't covering Kickstarters anymore. In the early days, it had been sort of big news, especially if games made a lot of money on Kickstarter. and the press pretty enthusiastically covered it. But then there got to be a real glut, I think, of Kickstarter games, and not all of them got finished, and so the press really backed off, and they weren't covering Kickstarter campaigns very much. So that was a little bit rough. We try to get out in the forums. We're active on social media, all that kind of stuff. But there are so many outlets now for communicating with people that it's hard to get everybody. So, yeah.
So I have two questions. The first one isn't really relevant to anything, but I think you mentioned that you worked at Looking Glass Studio.
Yeah.
So is that a hardware company or a software company?
No, software. So Looking Glass, there was a company called Blue Sky, which was based in New Hampshire, who did basically the original Ultima Underworld. And my company, which was Learner Research, we did this racing game called Car and Driver Interactive Road Test. And then Looking Glass was formed in 1992 in Lexington, Massachusetts, and they did, so Ultima Underworld came out a little before that, but then System Shock and Terra Nova and Flight Unlimited and Thief and I don't know, the other big games. I don't know. Anyway, I was sort of on the tech side of it, but one thing that was great about Looking Glass was they had just a lot of really good designers who are really interested in innovative game design. So, like Thief was a really early entry into sort of a stealth game. It wasn't just all about shooting. And System Shock was a science fiction thing that had these weird little hacking elements. So there were a lot of really interesting game elements that worked into all that stuff.
I asked because I thought there's a recent company that's making experimental 3D displays. So I guess that's probably
Yeah, it's probably another company.
So I have a second question.
Yeah.
It relates to advertising that everyone asking some.
Yeah.
You did a little bit of everything. You had Kickstarter, you've gone to PAX and conferences.
Yeah.
You tried social media advertising. So I take it you don't know if any of these had a bigger impact over the other they're doing. Where do you think?
We had a big impact when I got John Carmack to tweet for us on our Kickstarter. That was nice. No, I mean, I can't say that like any one of those things was like a huge win, or any one of. I mean, I think would have been the huge win is for like a huge streamer or YouTuber to cover us, and I don't know how to make that happen other than get lucky. So, yeah.
Would you do Kickstarter again?
Maybe if I were younger. It's like having kids, It's all right when you're in your 20s, and then it gets to seem a little exhausting. Anything else? Yeah.
I have some, of course, marketing questions.
Yeah.
You said you had 3 months of the PR firm.
Yeah.
How did that line up with your launch?
It was like 2 months before and 1 month after, basically.
Okay, we got a little bit of
And you want to line up previews and reviews fairly early, and they have to get slotted in based on what other games' release schedules are. So you can't wait too long. We might have waited a little bit too long, but definitely you want to hit some of that stuff early.
Another marketing PR question. Did you do any outside of the firms? Did you guys do any of your own PR, Twitter handle?
Yeah, so we had a Facebook page and we tweeted. We had forums on our website, which actually proved to be fairly popular. When we got posted to launch, we had a Discord, which is now, we've sort of moved away from the forums on the website and everything's on Discord now. And those are all good things for sort of cultivating a community. I don't think Discord's going to build the community. I think, but your current people, it's a great way to communicate with them and have them talk to each other around multiplayer games or that kind of stuff. I don't know, like Twitter or something is really hard to say.
Yeah. How much of your time is put into that?
We had one person who was sort of our social media person, and then also our tester handled some of that more like on the support side. So it was a fair amount of work. I personally wasn't that excited about doing that kind of stuff, so I didn't do a lot of it. But I went to PAX and showed the game off for 3 days, and that was really fun. I got a lot of great feedback there, so that was kind of fun.
You mentioned that Unity made things really easy for you in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Aside from learning it and sort of not being accustomed to the whole thing, like this is someone else's engine, and
Yeah.
I don't get to control everything here. What were the biggest technical challenges that you had on the project using Unity? Just talk about what accelerated, what was difficult with it.
One thing I know is a challenge is we have support for add-on levels. We released an editor, and we have add-on levels. So we had to figure out a way to do that because people, you can download free versions of Unity, but then we had our own custom tools. And so we ended up basically writing something where we save a bunch of data out from our level editor and create levels on the fly as we read them in. And we had to put a lot of stuff in resources to make that happen, which just sort of slows down some loading. In other cases, makes it inefficient or a little bit bloated. So that proved to be kind of tricky. One of the great things about Unity is there's so much stuff available in the store. So we're using like the rewired input system. I don't know if people have heard of that, but it's really nice. The guy who does that has been super supportive and supports tons and tons of different joysticks. That kind of stuff is super, super nice. I think what else was a challenge? Like some of the graphic stuff was hard because I think Unity is actually making some big improvements in the latest releases where they've got some more programmable graphic stuff. But we ended up going through a lot of different plugins to try to get different effects. So we would, we tried this plugin and see, is this giving us good, screen space ambient occlusion or whatever. What's the performance like? Is it good? And then when we switch to another project, or especially a lot of effects, we download some bloom effects or some particle effects, and because it wasn't built into Unity, a lot of those things we had to sort of do a lot of experimentation and figure out what worked.
How much downloading from the assets did you do, and how much of it after downloading and buying did you throw away?
I mean, we didn't download any assets per se, but a lot of plugins. So effects plugins, the audio effects plugins, the input system. We're using an anti-cheat thing that we downloaded.
And you, for the most part, used all the apps or all of the things that you downloaded?
Yeah, I think
downloaded by this didn't work out. So
we ended up using almost everything. A couple things we didn't end up using. A couple things we didn't have to pay for because the companies stopped supporting them. So we're like, well, you can use it for free now. And that's a little tricky too because then Unity updates and you're hoping the plugin still works. But on the whole, yeah, I don't think we took too many. We did switch our input manager fairly early. I'm not sure what we were using in the beginning, but we ended up switching to Rewired. So that was something where we changed our mind. In the beginning, we just would purchase one copy of everything, get it working, and then some of the plugins are one per seat, so we ended up buy 11 copies or whatever it is. But we usually have one person check it out and make sure it worked before we do that. Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about the trying to catch the long tail of overload and kind of ride that out. What are the plans for Overload? Is there any continuation? Is there something that you guys are thinking about for the studio?
Yeah.
It's early on.
Yeah, we've talked about some DLC. We're probably actually doing a user-created level contest where we're going to have people submit levels and then release those as a DLC package. We've got, as I said, the editor, so people create their own levels. We don't support that in multiplayer right now. I mean, the levels would work in multiplayer. The hard problem is making sure everyone has them. So if someone has a homemade multiplayer level, the server has to have it, and the server we're using AWS for our multiplayer backend, so it has to get distributed to all the different nodes and all the different players. And that part of it we haven't done. So we're at the very least going to support add-on multiplayer levels for LAN games where everyone can just make sure they have it themselves. But for the general online stuff, we haven't done that. So that's something we might do. We've talked about co-op. people are interested in that, but it's kind of hard, so we're still thinking about that. Talked about the Switch. So, cool.
English only or doing international?
We did English, French, Spanish, German, and Russian. We used a translation company out of Romania, I think. They did a pretty good job. The original German translation was apparently really bad. All of our German backers kept telling us it was really bad. So we just wrote to them and said, we hear this German translation is really bad. And they said they'd review it. They came back and said, yeah, it was really bad, so we redid it. So,
Now, the first time I've heard the version of that story.
yeah, so I mean, they just have contractors, whatever they work with. So they just, I guess, found a different contractor to go through and redo everything. It's not that expensive. I'm not sure how much difference it makes in terms of sales. Like we talked about it in Polish because we had a guy who was like really into it and was going to maybe do it for us. We based one of the nice things again about having the early access was we could see where our customers were from. So right, the traditional is like the e-figs, right? So English, French, Italian, German, Spanish. And then we thought maybe Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and then Russian because we had some Russian backers. But it turns out like we had like almost no copies in Italy. Spanish was actually very low. I mean, I don't know, just whatever cultural reasons, Germany is really huge for us. And everything else is fairly small after that. So even supporting, French probably there's not that many users out there. And then even to like Spanish, I mean, if you're really serious, Spanish is so different in so many different places. So you have to, are you doing, Spain Spanish? Are you doing Mexican Spanish? Are you doing whatever? So, yeah.
Any reason why you chose not to do any of the Eastern languages? Japanese, Chinese, Korean?
Yeah, we've actually talked about whether to do a Chinese version. I mean, the Chinese market is potentially very large, still a little bit opaque, I feel like. I think our main thing there was that Descent was never a huge seller, although we did have a version out in Taiwan or something, but it wasn't a huge deal in Asia. So, and then we didn't get like a lot of Asian backers from Kickstarter, so it just seemed like it wasn't the right kind of game for that market.
In terms of funding sources, did you get any outside investment or any grants from the government?
We had one outside investor, and it's just someone we knew who was interested in putting some money in the game. We didn't go after any sort of grants or anything like that. I mean, years ago, I did a project that did the Michigan game grant when that was still around. It was a bit of a hassle, but in the end, it was a few $100,000 of free money, which is pretty nice. So, but they discontinued that. So. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the custom tools you made?
Yeah. So the original Descent back in '95 was based. All the geometry was based on these little cubes, and you make tunnels by stringing a bunch of cubes together. And you can make big rooms by stringing a bunch of cubes together. And the reason for that was for the graphics occlusion algorithm that we had, which is this sort of portal-based thing where you would take, you'd be looking at one side of a cube, and then you could sort of see what was visible from there, out of that, and get successively smaller viewports, and then clip off things that weren't visible. And that was something that was sort of a new technology that we developed back then. So we ended up using the same thing here now because it was sort of this retro thing. We were going for the same thing. So basically, we wrote this very simple editor that just lets you create these cubes and deform them and attach them together. Very similar to the editors we had a long time ago. And then those we would export to Unity and breed them in as a scene file. And then we tried to do a fair amount in our editor. As the project went on, we ended up doing more and more directly in the scene file, which is a little bit sloppy in that it's a little harder to reproduce something. But if you made major changes to the level, then we'd break some of that stuff. Like we would place all the ambient occlusion stuff and ambient audio sources just directly in Unity instead of in our editor. But we only did that sort of at the end of the project when the levels were basically not changing. So the last minute finishing sort of stuff. So yeah, basically it's basic geometry and texturing. Like I said, robot placement too was in there. So, but mostly that's because you know, the guy who wrote the tools, the guy who's designing most of the levels, he has a certain workflow that he likes. You know, he very keyboard based. You know, doesn't do a lot of stuff with like whatever. He's got his thing, and he's a very productive guy, and will let him do whatever he wants because he does great work. So that was his thing. Yeah.
Getting back to the translation.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious as to once it is on consoles, will you be reconsidering translating into more languages because it has much greater potential?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's fairly easy for us to drop new languages in, so that's a possibility. Yeah, we've talked about doing that.
Yeah, I mean, some countries really don't have PC gamers.
Yeah, that's right. So there may be other markets. Yeah, I mean, it's easier for us to say like, well, if it does well in some market, we'll translate for that market, but maybe it would do well in that market if we had translated, so it's hard to tell. One of the things that was unusual, I mentioned self-publishing. We, in addition to having to figure out all the marketing and PR, we had to figure out all the console stuff. So console submissions, which is pretty tricky. There's a lot of stuff you have to do. That was definitely a lot of work, figuring all that stuff out. And having to do, you know, basically all the translation stuff ourselves and all the console stuff ourselves. It was kind of an interesting learning experience. So.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, Matthew.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to